Hi everyone, welcome to lecture guide number 7 on Picasso, Pablo Picasso, and the movement known as Futurism. We're basically going to be looking at the early career of Pablo Picasso and then one of the movements, Futurism, that is associated with what art historians call the historical avant-garde, which I'll return to in a moment. So before we get into this lecture, there are a couple of things that I will be covering in relation to Picasso that have to do with art criticism. Art criticism arose, of course, during the 19th century, but it really gets going as a kind of professional supplement to art during this time period of the rise of modernism. And it's really important to understand what the critics were saying and how they were supporting modern artists, to understand how this then was glorified in the realm of art history and art criticism. But it's also really important for you to know that when I'm talking about early critics such as Clive Bell, who you've had to read for this week, his famous essay, An Aesthetic Hypothesis, as well as just criticism in general, that critics are generally speaking interested in questions about art that sometimes really nicely line up with what the artists themselves were trying to do, or at least one aspect of what artists were trying to do. But in other ways, critics don't focus on trying to tell you what the artist's intentions were, or what the artist's goals were, or all the different things that an artist might have been interested in as an art historian would. Critics instead are interested in the question of what makes art art and why particular forms of art should be thought of as better or stronger than other forms of art. So they don't look at every single question like we've been doing in this class. But formalist art criticism that rises at this time, a type of art criticism that focused on the form elements of art as the kind of starting point for all art, the essential characteristic for all art, were very important in supporting the rise of modern art. And so we're going to take a little detour in me explaining some of the goals that Picasso had and what his work was all about, to look a little bit more at how formalist art critics in the beginning of the 20th century made arguments about what art was in its essence and why particular forms of art might be considered stronger than other forms of art. So let's start this again by refreshing our memory about modernism. Modernism as a historical moment, as I've talked about before, is this intensification in a lot of different realms of not just artistic activity, but philosophy and sciences as well, to figure out what the strengths and limitations of each field of cultural inquiry might be. We've been talking about painting, and so when we first started talking about this question, it came up with respect to Edouard Manet. And I was saying that people like Edouard Manet were really interested in the question of what the strengths of painting were, what its essence was. Did it have a particular kind of representational logic to it? And trying to figure that out so as to strengthen painting by locating it more firmly in the areas that it was really good at. And Manet early on, of course, represents this kind of essentializing tendency, returning painting to being seen not just as representational forms of figures in space and landscapes and so forth, but also making us see that it is a painting on a flat two-dimensional surface with its own visual qualities that are just as important as whatever that painting represents. Now we went on from this and said, when we get to artists like the Impressionists, those artists are interested in a kind of similarity between the optical experience of seeing things, the image on the retina, and a correspondent surface of a painting that mimics the kind of light effects that we see in the world. And then even more importantly, we went on to start talking about expressionist modes of painting. These are all modern tendencies, slightly different approaches to the question of what is the essence of painting, or what are its strengths. But the Expressionists, of course, come at this again saying, hey, why would I represent something perfectly accurately or photographically seeing as how if you want to see something that looks real, look at something in the real world, or photography as a medium of art does a much better job at representing accurate likenesses, or even sculpture, which is by its very nature three-dimensional already. So the Expressionist said, what I want to do is use what is the fundamental starting point of all painting, meaning color and line and shape, all of these things that we call the formal elements of art, to express or evoke a message. I can manipulate form, I can change the way things look, because I know, for instance, that a diagonal line or a choppy line or, a very, very bold contrast of black versus white will have a particular physiological, effect on the viewer. And I really want to communicate a message through those basic forms of art rather than through the indirect method of associating a form with something else. And I'll keep picking this up today, but remember the idea for the Expressionist was, I will manipulate or change the local colors or the local form, meaning what it really would look like in real life, because I think those exaggerations will express my emotional state or the thinking that I have or the concept I want to purvey better and more, and this is key, more strongly through the basic essence of painting, which is color, line, form, and shape, and so forth, than an accurate representation would. When we get to people like Picasso, he's interested early in his career with Expressionism. Later on, he's interested in just formal qualities, meaning art that is going to make you have a kind of aesthetic response to it. I really like this kind of design that he's using, or what have you. And then, we'll see he uses his art at certain stages, piling together expressionist approach, formalist approach, symbolism, and so forth to get at big, huge political messages, especially in the 30s. So let's kind of work our way through this then. One of the things that I like to do right off when we're talking about Picasso is use him as an example to dispel something that I think is a very common belief among a lot of people about modern art. And that's that modern artists just aren't as skillful as those academic classical artists that we were looking at the beginning of the quarter. They weren't very good, let's say, this is the mythology, at representing accurate form, and therefore they just kind of, hedge their bets and create these abstract forms because they can't do any better. Now that's not true at all. Most of the modern artists, certainly all of those that you've looked at so far, did go through a great deal of training and could accurately represent form pretty easily. And this is certainly true of Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso's family, his father was an art educator. He went into artistry, Picasso did, very early in his life, and was frankly a child prodigy. He was just fantastic at doing the kinds of things that an academic trainer would have been asked to do, in their schooling. And he could do them really young. So, one of the things that I said before is that academic training started with drawing, and you drew, still lives, and then you progressed to drawing plaster casts of famous sculptures, and then finally you moved on to drawing live models, and from there into painting and so forth. So what you're looking at here on the screen is a very early work. It's not on your lecture guide because you don't really need to remember. It's just a simple little example from Picasso's training when he is 10 years old. This is Picasso when he's 10 years old doing part of the academic training, which is drawing a plaster cast, in this case, of a foot. Now at 10 years old, clearly this guy's got a ton of skill and can represent form accurately if he so wishes. So as we move forward, keep this in mind. These artists aren't doing what they're doing because they can't do what an academic painter does. They're doing what they're doing because they're interested in these questions about modern art and what painting can do better than anything else and what its essence is and so forth. Here's another example. Again, from Picasso's training, he's about 11 years old right now, exceptionally gifted artist. Or Now he's about 14, 15 years old, painting this incredible oil painting, really accurately, or 14 years old here as well. My slides will go forward, excuse me. Here, 14 years old, very, very good, obviously, and very, very kind of accurate representations. But then he gets really caught up in, of course, the rise of modern art. He is certainly one of the most famous of the modern artists. And he moves from his home in Barcelona, at least for a couple of summers initially, to Paris to surround himself with the other modern artists. And then by the time he's 21 years old, he is living full-time in Paris and surrounding himself with people like Henri Matisse and many of the other modern artists. The first work that is on your lecture guide by Picasso is this work. It's a self-portrait from 1901, done during what is called Picasso's blue period. Now, Picasso's art, he was an incredibly prolific artist. He created, literally hundreds of thousands of works of art over the course of his career, is usually divided into stages. And I put all these stages on your handout. But this first stage is called the blue period because he painted predominantly in blue tones. There's a lot of mythology about why he did this. Certainly he was kind of depressed when he moved to Paris. He didn't have very much money. Times were pretty tough for him, and blue is a fairly depressive color. That's one explanation. Another was, and this one's completely not believable, that he just didn't have enough money to buy other colors of paint, so he stuck with blue primarily. But the most compelling explanation for why he stuck with blue is that many artists will simplify their palette to a monochromatic palette using just a few tones, like blues and a little bit of red here, to focus in on form and line before they start really dealing extensively with color, which usually comes a little bit later in their career, or sometimes can anyway. In this work, when Picasso does this about 1901, of course, the big thing that's around is Expressionism. And it seems pretty clear that he's trying to express his inner feeling at this time by simplifying the form, by using a predominance of blue here, by creating a fairly gaunt-looking face so as to, make us feel that he's a little bit bummed out, right? Things are pretty tough for him right now. He's exaggerating, in other words, the way something would have really looked so as to get to a feeling. Let's spend some more time on this one to develop this idea of Picasso's blue period and his interest in expressing ideas. This work is called The Absinthe Drinker. We've seen a couple of works on this theme already, one by Descartes, literally called The Absinthe Drinker, the other one called The Plum by Manet, on the subject of young women coming to Paris and feeling alienated. We've kind of covered this story before, because they can't get the life that they want to, and they end up having to work, really menial jobs, or even having to prostitute themselves. And modern artists, playing that role of the flaneur that we've talked about before, notice this and develop this theme in their art. Anytime for the most part, anytime you see a work about absinthe, it's about escapism. It's about drinking too much, or drinking a type of liqueur that was associated with hallucinations, so as to escape a world that's not very good to you. But with that being said, the key component of this is clearly this doesn't look as accurate as either Degas' work or Manet's work, and that's because he's trying to express the idea of a kind of inward turn or introspection or escaping into yourself through not the way something looks, right? Not a woman who is sad, as we saw in Degas and Manet's work, but rather through his use of line and color in particular here. What I'm thinking about here is we've talked about this before, that blue is a color that tends to feel like it's receding away from us and contracting into itself. And when you look at the clothing that she's wearing with all of these blues in it, it always looks to me like that shawl that she has over is just kind of wrapping into herself, and she's getting more interiorized with that use of blue that gets darker in the middle so as to make it feel like it's pulling into itself. Now that's not the way, of course, a shawl would really look. What he's doing is he's manipulating form so as to give you the idea of someone turning inward, just being kind of caught up in their own feelings rather than being associated with the outward social world that they exist in. And that use of blue is then complemented by his major compositional shape, in this case the circular form that starts with the glass of absinthe and then is picked up again by the table and is picked up again by the major lines in her shawl that follow the shape of that table, and then behind it, not even sure what this is this part of the wall or just a design element, another circular form here. Now all those circles again pull this whole composition into itself. They don't spread out so much as kind of pull everything in to the glass of absinthe or to the interior of this figure, because the whole theme is about someone dissociating themselves from the outside world and just being caught up in their own deep depressive feelings. Or in this work, just very briefly, this one's called The Blind Man's Meal. Once again, the subject is a difficult one. A blind man who, is having his meal here, a meager existence, fairly depressive, where Picasso, it's again during his blue period, is using blues to get at that expressive feeling of depression or locked inside oneself this man literally can't see. But the other component of this is Picasso playing with the way that the form elements of painting affect us visually and psychologically. When we look at this work, you'll see a lot of texture, and they don't come across well, of course, in the slides that I'm showing you. But all these areas in the background that look like lighter blue, that's actually Picasso coming back over a slightly set up oil painting with a rag and kind of taking some of the paint off so that you see the texture of the canvas behind it. And everything in this painting has a little bit of tactile quality to it that is, of course, emphasized by the man reaching out to touch this kind of glossy vase. What he's really getting at is the experience of this figure, which doesn't take place through sight, but takes place through touch. Now, Picasso, of course, is working in a medium painting that's all about visuality, but he wants to emphasize this other component to painting that we don't think about a lot, which is that the surface of a painting, the way that the paint is applied, also makes us respond to it through a kind of visual tactile quality. We see that texture and we feel that texture in ourselves. And Picasso's just playing around with those ideas here early on. Many of his early works, of course, are about these depressive subjects. Times are tough for him. This one is called Mother and Child. The Mother and Child picture is kind of redo of a painting that he did of his mother early on. And this young figure is probably meant to be associated with Picasso in some level. And you can see once again the two figures look away from each other. They've been abstracted some. We just get caught up in the emotional quality. When you start to see more of these reds in the painting, this is when Picasso's moving to his so-called rose period, where the color rose, or a kind of brickish red, starts turning up in his paintings a little bit more. But these are still paintings that are primarily about expressing human emotions through the form qualities of painting rather than an accurate representation of things. If you're wondering, Picasso in this, or the young boy in this, is dressed as a circus performer, what were known as saltimbanques at the time. These were kind of traveling gypsy performers that Picasso started to identify with, because he also felt that these circus performers were people that everyone enjoyed when you would go to the circus to be entertained, but they were all gypsies and kind of outcast from society and didn't really fit in, which he felt was a little bit about like being a visual artist. Everyone was interested in your work, but you're a little bit of a bohemian crowd and you didn't quite fit into society. Picasso's big turn, one of the big things that he's known for early on in his career, is moving further and further towards abstraction. And one of the impetuses for these moves towards greater and greater simplification of form and greater interest in the expressive qualities of form came through his study of Iberian, meaning southern Spain, and African masks. A lot of modern artists looked at works of art, or what we call works of art, produced by tribal societies, what they used to call primitive societies, like those crazy cool African masks, or closer to home, think of Native American works of art, either masks or totems and so forth. And they looked at these things and they said, look at this, here are all of these primitive artists is what they call them. That's of course, politically incorrect term these days, but that's the term they use. These primitive artists who can express really complicated ideas or impact us at a kind of gut visceral level through the abstract form of their masks. That's, these modern artists, and many of them did this. Gauguin, who we didn't look at, Van Gogh, Matisse so far, Picasso, and many others looked at all these African masks and thought, wow, there's something to be learned from these. There's no reason why our art has to be accurate. Look at how powerful these works of art produced by primitive cultures were. In fact, I'm continuing to use that term primitive, even knowing that it's totally incorrect politically, for a simple reason. They believe that these so-called primitive cultures were more in tune with the powerful forces that drive human beings than we are in our very, very civilized societies. And they thought that the works of art produced by these so-called primitive cultures were expressive of those primitive, visceral qualities of humankind, which they wanted to get to. Now, Picasso went to the Musée Trocadero, which later on was named the Museum of Man, and saw this incredible exhibition of African arts, and really got caught up in this and started to apply kind of mask-like forms to his own art. What you're looking at here is on the left, Picasso sitting in front of a couple of Iberian masks. These are masks from basically southern Spain. If you don't know this already, Spain is separated from North Africa just by the Strait of Gibraltar, and it's a very close journey. And there have been cultural interchanges between Spain and Africa for literally thousands of years by this point that influenced Spanish architecture and artistic forms. And Picasso is using that form to represent, in the painting on the right that you see here, his portrait of Gertrude Stein. What he's done is he's simplified her face, right? He's turned that face into something that looks like a mask-like form in order to express the power that he feels in this famous woman. If you don't know, Gertrude Stein was a famous poet and writer and theorist on modernism. You might want to take a look at her own poems, which, just like modern art, are kind of strange as far as poems go for most of us, because, they don't have rhyme, they don't necessarily have the same kind of allegories to them. Many of the times, people will read a Gertrude Stein poem and not really get that the poetry of Gertrude Stein's poems is the basic formal elements of poetry. It's kind of meter, it's cadence, it's the sound of words, rather than necessarily what they mean. And so she's a modernist poet in her own right. And she's someone that Picasso hung out with quite a bit, because Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo used to hold these informal gatherings of modern poets and philosophers and artists of all kinds to share their ideas with one another. And it became a kind of watering hole for modern artists to come together at the Stein's house and talk about their ideas. Now, Gertrude Stein was a fairly big, strong woman, incredibly sharp intellect. She wasn't beautiful by contemporary standards, and he doesn't want to represent her that way. What he wants to do is give you a sense of her inner strength, her resolve, her power, by making her form even bigger, by making her eyes into these kind of almond shapes, by giving her this kind of no-nonsense, powerful look that he saw in Iberian masks. Before we go into this work, I'm just going to take a brief pause. Notice very little, and I'll be right back. Or maybe you'll notice a lot. Excuse me for a minute. I'm having technical difficulties here, so I'll be right back. Sorry about that. I think I've got it figured out. So back to this really famous work by Picasso. In 1907, Picasso, right in the midst of him being really interested in African masks, he's just seen this famous museum exhibition at the Musée Trocadero, created this famous work called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And that title is essential here. Les Demoiselles is a kind of slang term for prostitutes, and Avignon, while it is also a town in the south of France, actually refers to the red light district in Barcelona where you would come across prostitutes. And he's actually responding to the work by Matisse called The Joy of Life and trying to pick up the other side of what Matisse was after. Matisse was after, as we remember, pleasure. And what Picasso's after is addressing and criticizing the tradition of the female nude as producing pleasure that masks male heterosexual anxiety in front of women that they find really attractive or assertive sexually. And we'll get to that as we go along here. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on this work because it's important both in terms of Picasso's own modern approach to dissecting and analyzing and criticizing the long tradition of the female nude, but it is also a work of art that a lot of formalist art critics really liked and thought was kind of the starting point for Cubism in the way that he fractures space in the background. But we'll get to that kind of step by step. First of all, remember the tradition of the female nude going all the way back to Ingres, had been something that a lot of modern artists were interested in interrogating. Matisse interrogated it with Olympia by pointing out that one of the things that the female nude had been doing is giving men basically a fantasy in which the object of their desire, a woman without her clothes on, would lie there in bed and give you this kind of come hither look. Now, when Manet goes at it, he inverts that entire scenario so that when you're standing in front of the picture, that woman in the picture, the Olympia, kind of has all the power and you feel kind of crummy about yourself. And he's doing that not to make you really feel crummy, but to think about how the tradition of the female nude has always kind of, made men feel comfortable in the face of something that they physically desire. What Picasso is doing here is upping the ante one step further. He creates these forms of these women in really aggressive, very, very kind of in-your-face postures, really angular lines. They look straight back out at you. Their faces look somewhat scary because they've all been transformed into masks. The two in the middle are Iberian masks. The three on the outside are all directly related to the masks he's just seen coming from Africa. And the reason he's using those masks here is pretty interesting. I've given you this quote on your handout, your lecture guide for today, and let me just read it to you. Because beyond the aesthetic kind of possibilities of primitive masks, what Picasso is saying in this quote is that masks are used by these traditional societies in order to give representational form to things that they fear or try to gain control over forces in the world that they don't know how to make sense of. What he's saying, in other words, is that these masks that were used in these societies in very ritualistic ways, right? Masks are performed by these societies in rituals, were a way for these societies to gain some kind of control over the world around them that they feared or didn't know how to make sense of by putting it into representational form. In a way, it's the way that religion works in general, right? Let's say, this is a really simplistic example, but let's take the simple one that religion is a representation of some of our greatest aspirations as well as some of our greatest fears. And so, for instance, in Christianity, one of the things you get out of that religion is the idea that, death, which is so fearful to people from a very early age, right? We're only going to live a certain amount of time, has meaning. If you live a good life, according to Christians, you will be reborn in heaven and have everlasting bliss. In other words, religion then represents life in a way that allows us to gain control or gain some meaning over these things that we really don't have any control over. And masks are part of the religion of these early societies and function much the same way. So Picasso said, quote, "Men had made those masks," speaking of these African masks, "as a kind of mediation between themselves and unknown hostile forces that surrounded them, in order to overcome their fear and horror by giving them form and image. At that moment I realized that painting isn't an aesthetic operation. It's a form of magic designed as a mediator between this hostile world and us, a way of seizing power by giving form to our terrors as well as our desires." If we reapply this to the subject of the female nude in art, you see what he's talking about. If what he's getting at is that, the female nude has been a way that men gain control over their desire for women, which is an overwhelming force for all of us, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, it doesn't matter. I'm sure you've all been around someone you found incredibly attractive and felt a certain amount of anxiety in that situation. He's saying, just as Manet had before him, that the female nude, traditional classical nude, is a way of gaining control over that by picturing a woman who is basically an object of your desire just there for you. Now he points that out, just as Manet had before him here, by showing us women that would have been seen as overwhelmingly sexualized, overwhelmingly confident, overwhelmingly in your face, something that's supposed to make you kind of fearful, like, oh my God, what am I going to do in this situation? In order to, again, draw our attention to the way that the female nude had functioned in the past. What we're looking at essentially is as if we were walking by, in the red light district of Barcelona, a window filled with all these women who are provocatively gesturing to us and asking us to come in for a sexual encounter. But it's not one that unfolds just according to our own male fantasy. These women's, again, angular bodies, very forceful looking looks, their distorted faces are meant to make us fearful about this sexual encounter so as to critique the entire tradition of the female nude. He wants us to think, for instance, that at root, men's desire for women can oftentimes be overwhelming and fearful and anxiety-ridden, and painting can alert us to this, both by making us feel good about it, but also just kind of drawing our attention back to the fact that this is part of our everyday lives. Now, on a totally different register of thinking about this work, the way that it's painted has a very odd space, right? In the background, you can't tell if these things that are in the background are actually in the background, all these little fractured planes, because they're, they seem to be right on the surface of the canvas at some points and other times receding behind it. But the reason they recede behind the figures is that they're all painted in blue that recedes, while the female forms are all painted in warm tones that feel like they're advancing. So he's drawing attention to the facticity that a canvas is two-dimensional, and that the space that he's generating in this is a function of his use of color. And a lot of formalists really like this. They're like, this is Picasso trying to get at creating a space that is purely optical, a space that just exists for our eye, not a space that we can imagine walking through. Here's a close-up of those masks, right? The mask on the right came directly out of this exhibition he saw, and that's one of the figures in Les Demoiselles over there. So he's kind of copying those to get at this idea that masks are mediating forces just as paintings mediate our fears and desires. Now, I want to pause here for a minute and really talk in depth about formalist criticism. I'm not going to talk about every single thing that you will have read about in your reserve reading for this week. The essay by the man that you see pictured here on the left, that's Clive Bell, called An Aesthetic Hypothesis. The guy on the right that you see there is Clive Bell's best friend and kind of the brains, frankly, behind the essay you read, Roger Fry, who wrote essays on the same subject. And so I wanted you to know that both of these people were very important to the development of what we call formalist art criticism. Art criticism that focuses only on the form elements of art rather than its subject matter or what the art represents. And the best way I know to get at this is to go back to the Matisse work again, which of course Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon was painted in competition with, a kind of antidote to this pleasure, and talk about what Clive Bell and Roger Fry, or Clive Bell in particular, was saying in An Aesthetic Hypothesis. So the key idea for Clive Bell in that essay that you will be reading is to determine what is the essential quality of any art form. What do all art forms going back through the ages have in common? And what he argues is that, and this is true, if you're to look at the history of art, there's only brief moments in which art is entirely representational. It's oftentimes very abstract, well before the modern period, is that the common factor in all art is that it produces in us, when we look at it, what Clive Bell calls an aesthetic emotion. Now, this is the most important thing to think about here. An aesthetic emotion, according to Clive Bell, is something that is produced not by the subject matter of art, but rather by the formal elements of art, what he calls significant form, the arrangement of color and line and shape and texture and space in such a way that it produces in us this aesthetic emotion. If you're getting tripped up about that term aesthetic emotion, remember in the essay, which you should have read by this point, that Clive Bell says, I don't want to use the term beauty, although many people in the past have used beauty to talk about what I'm calling an aesthetic emotion, because beauty can be too commonly misidentified as regular beauty in the world. So a good example would be, I see a beautiful woman and I call her beautiful, and then if I see a picture of a beautiful woman, I call that beautiful too. And that's not what Clive Bell is getting at here. What he's saying is that it is the color and the line and the shape and so forth in combination to one another that produces in us this pleasurable feeling that sometimes, indiscriminately we call beauty, but he wants to be more specific and call significant form, because he wants to make sure we understand that the aesthetic emotion of a painting or of a sculpture or any art form comes or derives directly from the formal elements of art and not the subject matter. So for instance here, let's say I'm looking at this painting and I say, hey, I love dancing. And frankly, I like female nudes, and I like music, and I like goats. Remember, there are goats in here. And I like picking flowers. These are all some of the subjects of the art, and I like all of those things a lot. And therefore, I like this work because it represents those things. Clive Bell would say, well, that's not an aesthetic emotion. What you're having is an associative emotion. You're having an emotion associated with things you like in everyday life, because you see them represented in this art. For Clive Bell, an aesthetic emotion is something that would come from this painting in that I look at it and I'm like, I love that color combination. I love that use of line over there. I love the space and the texture. It's just a product of the formal elements themselves. Again, this significant form that he talks about that makes me like this art. Now for Clive Bell, an aesthetic emotion is something that comes to us without any thinking involved at all. We just look at a work of art and we are filled with this aesthetic emotion spontaneously. We don't have to know anything about the work in order to have this feeling that we have in front of the work of art. Now, if this is true, so the argument goes, and it is a really powerful argument during the time all the way to the mid-century, mid-20th century that is, then stop and think about this. If the common thing that all art has is that it produces an aesthetic emotion through the combination of the formal elements, then works of art like this, that are modern works of art, are just or could be just as good as an old master painting or sculpture by Michelangelo or who have you. See, the thing was that in Michelangelo's work, so this argument goes, the real art in that is his combination of line and color and shape. It's not that he's really good at representing accurate or idealistic form. Going one step further, think of it this way. If a modern artist is no longer really all that interested in representing accurate form, And since accurate form, according to this argument, formalist art criticism, isn't really all that important to whether it's art or not, then a modern artist, by focusing themselves on questions about the combination of line and color and shape, rather than whether something looks accurate, might be able to produce even better, stronger works of art because they're not concerned with things that, as Clive Bell puts it, are superfluous or extraneous to the art experience, right? It doesn't need to look accurate because that's not the thing that produces the aesthetic emotion anyway. Which brings us to these works. In the second decade of the 20th century, starting around 1910, 1911, Picasso and his friend George Braque are working out what becomes known as Analytic Cubism. And what you're looking at here is one of the most famous Analytic Cubist works called Ma Jolie, which is actually printed on the surface of this canvas down at the bottom here. Formalist art critics looked at this and loved it because, again, these things don't translate well in slides, but when you see these things in person, they are really visually compelling. They're very, very, very interesting forms. And of course, the formalist art critics are saying it doesn't matter that this thing doesn't have a recognizable form. The combination of various different textures and different contrasts and different lines produces this aesthetic emotion, so they argued. What Picasso seems, though, to have been up to, besides just trying to produce an aesthetic emotion to us, or something that's basically pleasing to us because of its design elements, also derived from his interest in critiquing the traditions of painting through Cubism. Remember, we said before with Paul Cézanne that one of his lifelong ambitions was to figure out the logic of painting. And in trying to do that, one of the things that he did was to look at objects from different points of view and then fuse all those different points of view into one painting. And that's one of the features of Cubism. It learned that from Cézanne. This is, at start, before it becomes what you're seeing here, Picasso looking at a woman holding a musical instrument known as a zither, a kind of little stringed instrument, from multiple different points of view, and then fusing all those different points of view together on the two-dimensional surface of the canvas. But even more than that, what Picasso is up to is taking some of the very conventions that painting had used to create illusionistic space that looks like the real world, and basically kind of criticizing those or making them fall flat on their face. Now, what I mean by that is one of the standard ways that an artist represents three-dimensional form is through what's known as modeling or shading, or the Italians used to call it chiaroscuro, light and dark. And what that is you've probably done this before, things that are closer to a light source, right? An object that's close to a light source or a surface that's closer to a light source is the most illuminated surface of that object. And then as it gets further away from the light source, it gets incrementally darker. That's called shading, right? Modeling. All the classical artists do it. It's a way of tricking us into believing what we're looking at is three-dimensional. What Picasso has done here is he's taken the logic of modeling. So look at this area in the center of the canvas, where something is dark on the outside and then gets progressively lighter, so that this area that's lighter should look a little closer to us, but then it abuts something that runs counter to that, something that's very dark and then gets lighter. Up here, dark and gets lighter, and then abuts something dark again. He's criticizing, in other words, or kind of derailing the way that modeling creates three-dimensional form. Or another way we create the illusion of three dimensions is, we know, and the famous example is train tracks, that train tracks are parallel to one another. But as they get further away, they keep getting progressively closer to each other, or that's how it appears to our eye, and we call that converging lines, and when that is systematized, we call that linear perspective. Here, Picasso takes forms that look at the bottom that look like they're going to be converging lines, but when they get up into this zone, they run parallels again to critique that idea. Or another famous one is overlapping, right? We know that a canvas is two-dimensional, but in order to make it appear that something is in front of something else, we overlap it. We put it on top of it. Here, nothing really overlaps anything else. everything is just on the surface of the canvas. Now, I know this is kind of esoteric and you're probably wondering, what the hell is this all about? Well, this is Picasso trying to work out what the logic of painting is by critiquing some of the major conventions by which painting had created an illusion of three dimensions. And instead, he's not trying to create an illusion of dimensionality. He's trying to create a situation in which you get space, or some kind of perception of space, that is a result not of conventions or illusions, but the actual physical properties of light and dark and line. When you look at a Cubist painting, this first stage known as Analytic Cubism, all of these different little cubes or planes, after about a minute or so, start tilting back and forth, and it creates this little kind of, there's no way to give it a firm size, but it's like a 3-inch deep space created just by light and dark and line and so forth, and all these little planes start tilting back and forth weirdly because it's an optical phenomena. Again, it's a property of light and dark and line and texture rather than conventions that are derived outside of the painting to create an illusion. Some other things that he's doing here is he's drawing attention down below. It says "ma jolie," of course, and these are letters on the surface of a canvas. Letters on the surface of a canvas make you think about the canvas's surface being two-dimensional. That is the essence of painting. It is a two-dimensional surface. But "ma jolie" is also a song. It's a song that one sings to, like, your sweetheart. It literally means my girlfriend or my pretty. And songs or music start to become one of the analogies that formalist critics and artists who are interested in modernism start to employ to explain what they're up to in their art. An easy way to put this is, in music, many, many times we are emotionally drawn into music, and it makes us feel particular ways, not necessarily because of the lyrics or the words that someone is singing in the song, but because of the actual musical notes and harmonies and so forth. Now, those musical notes and harmonies are, by their very nature, abstract. They don't have any direct meaning. And painters started to say, why can't, if music is all about using just notes and sounds and various arrangements to create emotions in us, why can't painting be thought of the same way? It doesn't need to be representational in order to have an emotional effect on us. Another example, just one more, so you can see more directly how these works start with a subject that is then seen from multiple different points of view that are fused on the canvas, is this work called A Portrait of Ambrose Villard, who was one of his friends and an art dealer and a kind of secondary critic of the time. And you can see his face in the center, but then his body gets dissolved into all of these planes. After Analytic Cubism, Picasso moves on to what's known as synthetic cubism, which is a kind of fancy way of saying collage, right? Cut and paste paper to build up form that will allude to figures and, in this case, representational subject matter, meaning he's got a point to make in this work called Still Life with a Bottle of Suze, rather than just being all about aesthetics per se. What I mean here is that when you look at this work, after a while, you might see a man sitting at a table reading a newspaper, and that newspaper is all around him, and you can actually read all the words on this newspaper. Having a drink. Suze is an aperitif, a kind of anisette. So he's sitting in a cafe, having a drink, reading a newspaper. Now, I could go on and on about the aesthetic qualities of this work, but what I want to focus on instead is something that becomes really important to a lot of artists who have social concerns in their art, along with just creating beautiful pictures, and that's a component of this work. A really important thematic that a lot of people were thinking about, and especially Picasso, and he started this when he was talking about masks being mediators, or mediating between us and the world, meaning giving representation to our feelings and thoughts so that we can make sense of them. is that a lot of artists started thinking about the way that our world is constantly mediated by the media here, by newspapers. In the beginning of the 20th century, newspapers, of course, are exploding. The way we get the news these days is through multiple media sources, right? Now we can find it in the newspaper, or probably most of us online, and we learn about our world through these writings by other people, which I think most of us know come at things from a very particular perspective. But even more essential is we're no longer witnessing things that are happening in the world firsthand. We're not even getting secondhand kind of reporting from people who have seen this necessarily. We get a lot of the information that we get about the world through the media, through mediated sources. That's important in this work because imagine you're sitting at a table reading a news story about some horrible event that's happening half a world away. You're likely not to be as engaged or as emotionally affected as if you were actually there witnessing it. And a lot of the newspapers that are here have to do with the First Balkans War that the French were fighting against a former colony. It was still a colony at this time that was really bloody and horrible and created a lot of political turmoil in France around whether it was appropriate to be a colonial nation in the first place and so forth. But what we see here is a man sitting in a cafe drinking a drink, reading about these horrible events, and Picasso may be commenting on the fact that, of course, in this venue, half a world away, we are not feeling things as directly as we would in a world in which we directly saw something or heard firsthand reports of something from a friend or someone who had been there. And this leads us to, again, there would be a million more works I could show you by Picasso, but I'm, giving you the highlights. This leads us to perhaps Picasso's most famous and important work. The work you're looking at here is called Guernica, and it's a work that he created in 1937, and it has everything to do with the political situation of the world at this time. Picasso was Spanish, and at this moment in the 30s, Spain was locked in a civil war. The basically fascist forces of General Franco were taking over Spain, and the Republican government, which was in exile at this point, commissioned Picasso to create a work for the 1937 World's Fair at the time, which, by the way, is about the weirdest World's Fair you'll ever see. It had pavilions, created by the Nazis and the fascists in Italy that were very, very political and basically telling everyone they were going to take over the world. And Picasso here is creating a work for, again, the Spanish Republican government who is fighting the fascist forces. And this work would be displayed in this World's Fair to show the horrors of the rise of fascism in Western Europe. The specific subject matter of this work has to do with the mass bombing of a fairly small Basque city, Guernica. Now this Basque city, and I'm showing you some photographs of the what happened to this city, wasn't particularly strategically important for the Franco forces as they sought to take over Spain, but they wanted to show their overwhelming power, and in particular the power of a couple of other nations who were their friends, the Nazis in Germany and the fascists in Italy. And so what they did is they invited the Nazis and the Italians to fly over this town and bomb the crap out of it. And the Italians and the Germans, more than just wanting to make a friend in Franco, were really interested in experimenting with their new war technologies. They started this bombing in order to have the maximum amount of impact in the early mornings of a workaday, and killed, untold numbers of civilians. And the bombing continued for over 6 hours, where they dropped at least 8 different types of bombs to see how they would work, including, according to reports, the first time that anyone had ever used indiscriminate carpet bombing. And they killed massive amounts of civilians here, basically to show Spain, look at how powerful we are, you better just lay down your arms and submit to our control. Now, When Picasso is painting this scene, of course, the horrors are immense. How do you represent something as horrible as the 6-hour bombing of a city that annihilates the city and kills thousands of people? How do you actually represent that in a painting in order to get at the real horrors of that event? After all, painting is a mediator, just like the newspapers we were just talking about. Well, the first thing you should know about this painting is that it is huge. It's over 20 feet wide. It's a giant mural-sized canvas. And what he's done here is he's basically put together everything that he can, everything he knows about art in order to represent the horror of this event. He, in other words, has used the form elements of sharp, jagged lines all over the place, really stark contrasts, lots of diagonals everywhere to get to the turmoil and anxiety of the situation. So he's using the form elements in order to express the horror. He's also, though, using standard symbolism. Symbols are all through this picture. So, for instance, over here on the far left-hand side, you see a bull. Now, a bull is a symbol of Spain. Think of Spanish bullfights and so forth. And this bull has two sides to it. It has a white head, white being a symbol of good, looking at us kind of proudly. By the way, if you're wondering, why did Picasso always do these weird things with the eyes? They don't look right. Picasso said, yeah, well, they don't look accurate, but by representing two eyes, I can show something about the feeling that I couldn't show if I only showed one eye, so I move them around wherever I want them. This is the proud face of Spain, to put it shortly. But as this bull wraps around on itself and you see its hindquarters, you see very prominently displayed his anus. And from that anus, his tail turns into what looks like a cartoon stink, bomb or something like that. And it's all dark here. That's the ugly side of Spain that's rearing its head under the forces of General Franco and the fascists. Right beside that, you see another symbol of universal lament, a mother holding her dead child. Or another symbol, a white charger, a horse. And the person riding this horse has fallen off that horse. The horse has been stabbed through the midsection. Now, white chargers and knights on white chargers are all about chivalry and fighting against, overwhelming odds. But in this case, this horse has been stabbed through its midsection. The person riding it has fallen off the horse and his arm has been cut off, meaning a lack of power. His sword has broken. He's been vanquished. He's not going to be able to fight despite his heroism. These are standard symbols. Even more importantly, at the top, you see a symbol that's Picasso's way of updating a symbol you've already seen in this class. When we looked at Francisco Goya's work, the 3rd of May, 1808, and I said that that little light box, which was man-made light in the front of the canvas associated with the Napoleonic soldiers shooting the unarmed civilians, that what Goya was talking about is man-made light being associated with the Enlightenment, with the idea of humankind trying to perfect itself without the help of religion. Here we see something really similar. This light up above is in the shape of an eye. If we were to go back to the 14th century or before, that kind of eye, which by the way is on the back of your dollar bill, is about God witnessing all things. We use that in symbolism and art, repeatedly from the Middle Ages forward. But here the eye, or what looks like an eye, has within it an electric bulb. That electric bulb is a symbol of technology, a symbol of man's enlightenment again. Now the advances of sciences, though, are being used to create war implements that can do this kind of mass annihilation of people. So he's saying, listen, the advances of sciences aren't necessarily for good. The replacement of moral values under religion with science, isn't a catch-all. It doesn't solve everything, especially when those technologies are used to kill people. Now, in addition to those symbols, which we could keep kind of enumerating, you'll see that Picasso is also using expressionism, exaggerating form so as to get at an emotional effect on us. And that's everywhere to be seen in this work. But most importantly, look at this figure looking out a window. Does she look surprised? And look at her hand reach out and put this light out there to see things even better. It's like she can't make sense of what's happening because it's so overwhelming. Or this figure who's running into the scene to see things. Look at how elongated she is, how big and heavy her feet are. That's like that feeling you get if you're in the midst of a trauma, something horrible happening where all time slows down and it all looks distended. Or this figure of, someone in a burning building screaming up at the sky. Picasso's just exaggerating form so as to express the feeling of this horrible event, right? So he uses form elements, he uses traditional symbolism, he uses expressionism so as to try to get at the horror of this event. And then finally, see all these dots everywhere through, especially on the horse here? That is supposed to look a little bit like newsprint, so as to say, listen, you might have read about this story in the newspaper, but I'm trying to give you a painting that will actually evoke in you the same horror that occurred for the people who were in the midst of this horrible event. And again, just like Goya, he's painting the scene so that people rise up and say, no, we're not going to allow fascism to succeed. Remember, this is where these things come from. Here's Goya, another Spanish painter, with that light box, and Picasso's kind of updating this whole scene in his own times. Now I end us on Picasso just by saying that Picasso's all over the place in his career. He created so many works of art of different qualities, things that are directly political, things that are very much a part of the modernist interest in what is the essence of painting and what are its strengths and limitations. And he also, of course, created paintings that are just incredibly beautiful abstract designs. So I wanted to leave you with this one, a young woman with a looking glass from a little bit before Guernica. So he did a lot of different things in his career. This is a work that is that very formalist interest in creating beautiful abstract designs of colors and shapes and lines. It doesn't really look like a woman looking in a mirror. It's just an excuse for him to create something that's visually appealing, or of course evokes in us an aesthetic emotion through the form elements of painting. So, right around the same time that Picasso is doing things like the Analytic Cubist works, a little bit after he's created Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a number of artistic movements arise in Europe that appropriate some of the approaches of Cubism to their own works. I really like artists associated with what we call the historical avant-garde. These are artists, by the way, the historical avant-garde is a term that art historians use to associate a number of different stylistic movements at the beginning of the 20th century with each other that were all interested in some kind of creating some kind of social change in the world. Avant-garde is a term that comes from French military culture that means basically the crack troops that go out in advance of the military, in advance of the kind of standard infantry to soften up the other side. They're like the special ops forces. And so in terms of artistry, we're really talking about the artists who are at the cutting edge of art when we say historical avant-garde. For our class, we'll be looking at 3 movements, one this week, the Futurists, and 2 next week, the Dadaists and the Surrealists, who are all considered members of the historical avant-garde. So the Futurists come from Italy, and initially their movement starts as a manifesto, which is why you're looking at the front page of Le Figaro, which is one of the major major newspapers of Paris at this time, a little bit like, the New York Times or something, where the Futurists, or in particular the leader of the Futurists, Filippo Marinetti, basically bought space in order to publish his manifesto, which you see here. Now that manifesto of Futurism, there's a little excerpt of this in your readings. There's also an optional reading on the manifesto if you want to look at that more closely. Was really interested in waking up the Italians by using really, really controversial language and basically trying to aggravate a lot of people, because at this moment in time, Italy hadn't done much in the realm of culture for years. For the Futurists, their big goal is to awake the Italian public to all of the changes that have been going on in the modern world, and to make artists change the world socially so as to embrace this new modern reality. I'm going to pause here for a second. So the Futurists, then, we have to set the stage a little bit more, I decided. Think about Italy for a minute. We haven't covered much Italian art in this class, and there's a good reason for that. There's not a lot going on in Italy at this time. And for people like Marinetti, who was a very staunch modernist, remember this interest in figuring out which parts of cultural traditions are relevant to the present and getting rid of anything that wasn't, and opening our eyes to a new modern reality that science was showing us. He felt like Italy, and many people in Italy felt this way, was resting on its great traditions of the past, right? Italy was famous for the Italian Renaissance, for Roman culture. They kept doing these outmoded artistic forms, and Marinetti wanted them to wake up to the present. He actually called he accused the Italian public of submitting themselves to a form of cultural narcolepsy, being asleep when it came to culture. And he talked about anyone who is interested in classical ideas or traditional values as being somehow, in and of themselves good, as passeists, which he meant, devoted to the past. And so their number one interest was to wake up the Italian public, to break them out of their passeist tendencies. And he initially did this through a manifesto. This manifesto read in part just to show you that basically what he's doing is trying to shock the Italian public back into attention, to aggravate them, and then to rechannel their energies towards something more productive. He wrote in this, for instance, quote, "We will glorify war, the world's only hygiene." That's a pretty tough one, right? Militarism, patriotism, the destructive genius of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and scorn for women. Now, he's pretty much offended, half of you by this point, if not more. And he means to kind of shock you out of your complacency to enter into social action. He went on to say, criticizing our interest in the classical past in particular, but also just being devoted to great masters rather than creating new, relevant masterpieces for the present. He said, quote, in the same manifesto, "We will destroy the museums, libraries, academies of every kind. We'll fight moralism, feminism, every opportunistic or utilitarian cowardice." And what he's getting at there is that museums, for him, are repositories of a past that's dead, and we need to wake up to the present. Now, the primary form that futurist artworks took were in these things called serate, or evenings, in which you see here a little kind of caricature of these. We're not going to go into this in any detail, but this is the earliest form of what we call today performance art, in which the artists got on stage and played music and declaimed what you'll see in a minute, these kind of abstract sound poems known as Parolian Libertà, and tried to energize the public into engaging with them. These types of productions, by the way, started with a whole host of little strategies to aggravate you, or frankly to get you energized. So I'll just give you a few of them. The Futurists were notorious for playing the media, so they would show up in town, usually in college towns, because they thought the younger public would be more interested in their ideas, and announce that they were going to be there with grand kind of pomp and circumstance, even though they were a kind of small little group. And everyone would get excited about these things and show up at the evening performance in usually a bar or a theater space, only to find that the Futurists had delayed the opening by 2 or 3 hours, so that everyone now is even more grumpy going into this and more energized and frankly has probably had a few more drinks before they go in there. When you are finally let in, you might find that 2 or 3 people have been booked in your same seat, which if you've ever been on an airlines and you see this happen, the most polite people kind of get grumpy with each other, and again, more and more energy building. You might sit down in your seat and find that they put glue on your seat or sneezing power to aggravate you even more. And the point of all these kind of hijinks was that once they did the performance, the fourth wall, as it's called, between the audience and performers was broken down. Now that fourth wall is something that's in standard theater, and some of you will have heard this term before. You know, when you watch a play, it's almost as if there's a glass barrier in between you and the performers in which you sit back kind of voyeuristically being entertained by what's going on in stage. Bringing down the fourth wall is taking that glass plane out and having the performers directly interact with you in one way or another so as to energize you and get you involved. Now they tried to do this primarily through Marinetti reading very loudly, declaiming his abstract sound poetry, which he called Parole in Libertà, or Words in Freedom. This is a key strategy of a lot of avant-garde art forms, but particularly the Futurists, to get you involved. Now, when he would read these, he would have his own kind of message to give you. But if you look at this and you start thinking, how am I supposed to read this? What do these things mean? You know, usually you read from left to right. Am I supposed to do that? What are these giant letter N's that look like, sharp shapes, or maybe even the fronts of bombs? What are they supposed to mean? The idea was that there is no rules. You enter into this realm of freedom and interact and make the meaning yourself. This was to get you involved in the art itself rather than sitting back and just watching it being performed. But a key component of all Futurism was agitating, as you heard in the manifesto, for a war. Remember, we talked about this briefly before when I was talking about Vasily Kandinsky's work, that a lot of very smart people thought that unless you had a big war, some huge social uprising, traditions, common kind of societal conventions would continue to hold people back from embracing, some kind of great future, that you needed a war to create a tabula rasa, or some kind of clean slate from which more advanced progressive forms of culture could emerge. So the Futurists agitated for wars in their serate, or evenings, through their performance art, and they also did it in their paintings as well. Now, in this work, which is by the Italian Futurist artist Umberto Boccioni, who's one of the most famous, and this one's called The City Rises, what you're seeing in terms of subject matter, if you can make it out, is in the background a big city or a factory, and in the foreground a couple of horses representing opposing forces, and lots of different figures fighting to revolutionize their world. At this point, the Futurists were reading a ton of very kind of, almost proto-fascist social and kind of political theory, including George Sorel's famous essay about the need for the lower classes to rise up over the upper classes so as to affect some kind of change. They were also deeply interested in the ideas of a French philosopher by the name of Henri Bergson, and this is key to this work and many of the Futurist works. Henri Bergson, who has recently become pretty much in favor again these days, was an early French philosopher who was interested in dismantling some of what he thought were misconceptions that guided our understanding of the world. He was a philosopher, so for instance, one of the things that he wanted us to think about is that 2 of the premises upon which we build our entire reality are basically not very accurate conceptions. And what he meant by that was these 2 conceptions were space and time, right? Now, I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about this again since you were a little kid, but space and time are so fundamental to the ways that we construct our reality that we barely even stop to think whether our ideas about what space and time are accurate. And for Bergson, what he believed is that they weren't at all. So for instance, when you think about time, we usually think about time as being somehow linear, right? You have a start and a stop, or a beginning or an end, or days go through cycles. But if you ever stop to think, was there ever a beginning to time? What happened before time started, right? How long is time going to go on? Are our very linear notions of time, which Bergson thought were premised upon the fact that we all are born and eventually die, really applicable to a world that has existed for billions of years, right? What is a different way to conceive of time rather than being linear or chartable by minutes and hours and days and years? These, for Bergson, were all fictions that we had made up to make sense of something that was too complex for us to really make sense of. His other argument was about our ideas of space. And likewise, when you were a little kid, I would be surprised if you didn't at one stage or another ask your parents, what happens after outer space? My kids sure asked me that question a number of times. And the thing is, how do you answer that question? Does space end? What happens after space? Maybe our ideas about what space are just premised upon our own really, really kind of simplistic human faculties and don't have a whole lot of bearing on the larger idea of what, again, space really is. Where does space start? Where does it end? Maybe the problem is that it doesn't begin or end because our own human ideas about space and, by extension, time aren't very accurate to the world in which we live. So Bergson had this idea that everything was in constant flux and motion, always changing. There were no stable entities. This is something, by the way, that has been basically proven by contemporary physics. He called this idea absolute motion. Absolute motion is the idea, simply put, that when you look at your hand or you feel your hand, you're understanding that hand according to your own senses. But if we were to look at this microscopically or at a molecular level, you know that the molecules that make up your hand are not so dissimilar than this empty space, or what we call empty space, that surrounds it. And that things are constantly changing and in flux, and nothing is a stable identity. Now, I know that's a really abstract philosophical notion, but when you look at things at a molecular level, things are constantly moving and changing and moving into something else and so forth. The futurists loved this idea because they thought that certain things that were going on in the world around them were opening up people's thinking to the idea of everything constantly being in absolute motion. And remember, absolute motion means that, at a molecular level, everything's changing, versus relative motion is one hand moving relative to another hand, which is our common conception of space and time. Anyway, the futurists, for instance, were driving through the Italian landscape in these new sports cars and witnessing the world blur away. And they thought, well, that blurring away is more accurate to the reality in which we exist, where everything's constantly in flux and moving, than the way that we actually see the world when we're not moving. Or electric lights that seem to dissolve form, or X-rays that seem to show us, things underneath what we could see, all seem to reveal this new reality to them. And they thought, this is very important because if you think that there are no stable identities, that everything's in flux and change, and that we've mistaken our view of reality for what really is reality, then if we embrace this new idea of absolute motion, we can say there is no reason to be interested in the past. We should all be thinking about new ways of conceiving the world in which we live. And the way that they represented this is, as you see here, through standard subject matter of a big revolution or revolt, but also through, and you can probably make this out, all of these little dynamic lines that make up this composition. Everything in here it looks like it's in movement or dissolving or just forming, everything in constant flux. Because the general term for this kind of metaphysics that Bergson was interested in is called fluxus metaphysics, the idea that everything's constantly in flux and in change. And again, if that's the reality of the world, and if science is revealing this to us, we should start looking for new ways of conceiving that world. So they use the form elements as well as subject matter here to represent that. And they called all these uses of diagonals and dynamic lines, force lines. Here's a better example of that. As these things progress, they keep getting more and more abstract. This is a work by Boccioni again called States of Minds, The Farewells. What we see here, kind of briefly put, is derived from Cubist ideas of representing multiple different moments in time or multiple different viewpoints on one canvas. The subject matter is a train station, and trains are coming in and leaving and coming in and leaving. Trains were emblematic of new sciences and new technologies that would, again, bring the modern public into a more modern world. You see people on both sides getting on and off trains, kind of different moments in time, all represented together to get at this fluxus reality that they are all interested in. Or you see them representing something as simple as a soccer player, or what the Italians call a football player. This one's just called Dynamism of a Football Player, a game of soccer all rendered in one moment on the surface of a canvas. Boccioni's most famous work is this, called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. And it's the form of, frankly, a kind of avant-garde artist striding through the world, trying to draw the public along with him. He looks a little bit military, as if he's in some kind of armor, but the most important part of this is he's trying to represent through sculpture the idea of successive moments in time unfolding to get at this idea of absolute motion. Sometimes, as in the work of Giacomo Balla, their ideas about absolute motion are directly derived from chronophotography or time-lapse photography that was being used a lot at this moment, right? You've probably seen all those pictures of horses running or people on pole vaults, trying to show you different moments in time all fused into one canvas. And here we see a little wiener dog walking away with a woman walking him, the chain waggling back and forth and so forth, to get at this idea of things in movement. Or later, Giacomo Balla, this is a work that is called Speeding Car plus Light. This is a car, again, driving through the landscape. Remember how new these ideas were to them, that you could drive in a car like now 60, 70, 80 miles an hour and watch the entire world blur away. For a futurist, that was showing you the reality of a fluxus world, constantly moving and changing and in flux. New technology could show us that, and now Balla is trying to represent the successive moments of a car and its lights and lights of streetlights all blended together in one space. And we'll end with this one just to remind us. The futurists were agitating for war. They thought war, again, could lead us to some new revolutionary tomorrow in which we basically got rid of all our old ideas, very modernist, and adopted new ideas that were more complex, more progressive, more in tune with the reality as they saw it. This work by Balla is called War. It's full of all these dynamic lines and changes. It even has a flag on there. It's their way of arguing for some kind of massive change in the world. Now, the sad reality is that when the First World War broke out, many of the Italian futurists joined in immediately because they thought, wow, this is our now moment, and ended up dying in that war. Well, I hope you've enjoyed a little kind of nice thumbnail sketch of Picasso's early career and a little entry into the realm of Futurism, and I look forward to talking to you next week about Dada art, very political arm of Dada in particular, and Surrealism.